Okay, today is the day we finish the book, and I'm so excited because I think you're going to really love the ending, and I hope you're enjoying this. Before we start though, I do want to go over a few things because I want to actually kind of review some of these slides a little bit, just so that we can remember where we started. And here, of course, is our cover of our story. And I don't think that you can see this very well, but it does say at the top, 2 million copies sold worldwide. And this was quite a few years ago, so I'm imagining when this book was published, so I would imagine now there have been even more. And remember, this is based on a true story. So Salva's story is true. Naya's story is true, but Naya isn't necessarily the name of an individual. Naya could be any girl living in Sudan. All right, so let's just take a little quick review, kind of walk back and see where we started. Remember, we started here in southern Sudan. Here's the country of Sudan. It's in the continent of Africa. We started here with the civil war in Sudan, and we started with soldiers coming. I regret that this map, which is important, it really goes out quite a little ways further, but it starts in his town of Lonarik, and it really follows the path crossing the Nile River, across the Akobo Desert, going into, if we could see further, into Ethiopia, and then down as they leave and go into Kenya. But unfortunately, this just doesn't cut it off. So let's see what happened next. All right, now the reason I took the time to show you the setup for the chapters is because, remember, each chapter has two stories. And there's Naya's story at the top, and then we've got Salva's story down below. The dates are different. Hers started in 2008, his started in 1985. And you may have wondered, why would there be two stories within this story? And I think now what you're going to see is the importance of this and how the author was able to kind of weave these together. Now we're finally in our final chapters. It's amazing. It is amazing. All right, let's change over to our next slide. All right, we started out meeting Naya and talking about the responsibility of young girls in going every day and collecting water and carrying it back to their village and then going back again, which is the reason most of the girls didn't attend school. And this is what the containers look like, and remember, they carried this on their heads. Here's another example of kids going and collecting this water. And here's an example, a picture of kind of the water that they're collecting. And it's definitely not clean water. We can see down here how muddy it is, how dirty it is. And remember, this water is used by animals. It's used for bathing. It's used for drinking. It's also used for the women come and wash their clothes in these same watering locations. I'm going to go here. This is an example of a typical South Sudanese village. And Salva's house, they use the materials that are what they have available. They can't go to a Lowe's or a Menards and get building supplies, so again, an example of what the houses look like and are made of. Okay, move on here. Slide, there we go. All right, so this was the inside of the schoolroom. You can see that the students are boys, and here's the teacher. So this is what a classroom would look like. And this was when the rebel soldiers came and overtook the village, and the teacher told the boys, remember, run into the bush. He said, don't go home, just take off running, run into the bush, do not come back to the village. And so here are some of the soldiers, and they look pretty heavily armed. I'm sure I would be running too. We did talk a little bit about the two different tribes that are found in South Sudan, the Dinka and the Nur, and we talked about tribal scarring and how that's a ritual for when boys become men. And that is how they're able to identify which tribe you belong to. And now here's a picture of the boys, and this is an actual picture of some of the lost boys as they were walking. And you can see they pretty much left with the clothes they were wearing. Some of them didn't have shoes, and they really just took off running and didn't have time to go home, grab stuff, and they would collect things along the way. But this is pretty much the outfit every day, every single day. All right, this was when they were walking and they came across the beehive and found honey and were able to get something to eat. Here's an example of boys, how they would carry the younger siblings. They would just kind of tie them on the back. And here's another example of people, not just the boys, but remember, as they were walking, they'd meet different walking groups, other people also looking to try to find a safe place to be able to go. Here's a picture of some young boys walking together. Again, nobody's got shoes on in these pictures. So, all right, this was a really sad chapter when Selva's friend Marin was killed by the lion at night when they were sleeping. And remember, these are events, true events based on his experience as one of the lost boys. This was from Naya's story. Remember when her sister got sick from drinking the dirty, contaminated water, and they had to walk 3 days to get her to a clinic and try to get medical help for her? This is when they crossed the river. Now, in the chapter, they had to make their own boats to try to cross the river. But the fishermen that live on this river, they would have had their own, that they just used every day. And here's a net that they used for fishing. We talked about that. The problem that they ran into when they got on the island with the mosquitoes, and the mosquitoes carry malaria, and that will make you really sick. Besides the fact that it would just hurt you to have all those mosquito bites, malaria is a really pretty significant illness that people do die from, and it could possibly make you sick for many weeks. So here are an example of some of the mosquitoes. Most people that live in areas where there are a lot of mosquitoes that carry malaria, that transmit malaria, use mosquito nets to cover them up at night when the mosquitoes come out. And here was the Akobo Desert, which it took 3 days for them to get across. And remember, it was so hot, and so they were so thirsty, and the uncle kept telling Salva, look to the next clump of bushes, just that far, look to the next clump of, whatever, just to kind of keep him going, because he was about ready to give up. And remember, it was at the Akobo Desert where Uncle was shot by the soldiers. We finally reach a refugee camp when we get across to Ethiopia. And the thing that's really interesting about this is Salva, when you look at all these people, and there are thousands of people that live in these refugee camps, and they make their tents, they're kind of little shelters out of plastic that are given to them by the aid workers. But to live someplace where you are really crammed in with thousands of people, but how you can be alone even when you're surrounded by thousands of people. And so Salva was pretty much just a little kid on his own, trying to find a little spot for himself in all of this kind of chaos. I don't know, kind of a mess. All right, here we are again. Here's another refugee camp. It looks like they received funds from UNICEF on some of these tents, so they have some better tenting material here. But these are what the refugee camps look like, and there are still refugee camps all over different parts of Africa. All right, we're back to Naya's story. We talked about the giraffe, all right, the iron giraffe. And here is the iron giraffe, and they brought it in, and what we learned the iron giraffe did was it's going to drill down for water. And so they had water gush up right in their village, which would mean that the girls would no longer have to make that journey every single day. We're back to Salva's story. They were kicked out of the camp in Ethiopia. They had to cross this river. The soldiers came, they chased him out, they chased him with guns, and they had to cross this river, which happened to be full of alligators. And if you remember back in the chapter, many people got swept away. It looks like the water's moving very quickly. Some got swept away, many people drowned, and people also got eaten by alligators. So, all right, we're finally in Kenya, which is a country southeast of Sudan. It's called Kakuma, is the name of this refugee camp. He's now 22 years old. Remember, he left the village when he was 11. So it's been 11 years that he has been walking, trying to find members of his family, trying to find someplace safe to be. So he's in Kakuma, he's 22 years old. He then leaves Kakuma and goes down here to the Ifo camp, which is also in Kenya, and he meets Michael, who is an aid worker, and he helps him. Michael teaches him some English and helps him. Here he is with Michael. And he was chosen at this camp to become one of the lost boys, one of the boys that was going to get to be airlifted and go to the United States. And so here they are getting on the plane. Chapter 15. Naya's story. Even though the water spraying out of the borehole was brown and muddy, some of the little boys wanted to drink right away, but their mothers held them back. The men kept on working with the drill. Their leader talked to Naya's uncle and father and some of the other village men. Later, Depp explained things to her. "Don't worry," he said. "The water is muddy because it's still mixed with the old water that they were using from the pond. They will have to drill farther down to make sure of getting deep enough into the good, clean water underground. And then they will have to put in the pipes and make a foundation with gravel, and then install the pump and pour cement around it. And the cement has to dry. It would be several more days before they could drink the water," Depp said. Nia sighed and picked up the big plastic can. Yet another walk to the pond. So this is what this is going to end up looking like. So far they just have the hole dug, and now they have to just finish things up. All right. Okay. Salva's story. The Lost Boys. That is what they were being called in America. The boys who had lost their homes and families because of the war and had wandered lost for weeks or months at a time before reaching the refugee camps. The aid worker explained this to Salva and the 8 other boys he would be traveling with. The woman spoke mostly English. Sometimes she said a word or two in Arabic, but she did not speak the language well. I'm going to go back to the plane. So he'll be traveling with 8 other young guys. She tried her best to speak slowly, but she had many things to tell them, and Salva worried that he might misunderstand something important. They rode in a truck from the Ifo refugee camp to a processing center in Nairobi, the capital city of Kenya. Endless forms had to be filled out. Their photos were taken. There was a medical examination. It was all a blur to Salva, for he was too excited to sleep, which made him too tired to grasp everything that was happening. But there was one clear moment when he was given new clothes. In the camp, he had worn an old pair of shorts and an even older t-shirt. He had taken as good of care of them as he could, but there were holes in the shirt, and the waistband of the shorts was stretched out and threadbare. The camp workers handed out clothing whenever donations came in, but there were never enough clothes for those who needed them. Now Salva's arms were piled high with new clothes: underwear, socks, sneakers, a pair of long pants, a t-shirt, and a long sleeve shirt to wear on top of it. And he was to wear all of these clothes at the same time. "It's winter in America," the aid worker said. "Winter?" Salva repeated. "Yes, very cold. You will be given more clothes in New York." "More clothes?" Salva shook his head. "How can I possibly wear any more clothes?" Salva could not believe his eyes when he boarded the plane in Nairobi. Every person had a seat, and they all had luggage too. With all these people, hundreds of heavy padded chairs and all those bags, how would the plane ever get off the ground? Somehow it did, like a bird lifting off lightly with a quick flapping of its wings, but with shrieks and roars from the engines as the plane lumbered down the long runway, as if it had to try hard as it could to get into the air. Once the plane was safely aloft, Salva stared at the scene outside the small window. The world was so big, yet everything in it was so small. Huge forests and deserts became mere patches of green and brown. Cars crawled along the roads like ants in a line. And there were people down there, thousands of them, but he could not see a single one. "Would you like a drink?" Salva looked up at the woman in her neat uniform and shook his head to show that he did not understand. She smiled. "Coca-Cola? Orange juice?" Coca-Cola? Long ago, Salva's father had once brought a few bottles of Coca-Cola back from a trip to the market. Salva's first taste had been startling. All those bubbles jumping around in his mouth. What a rare treat it had been. "Coca-Cola, thank you," Salva said, and with each sip he remembered his family passing the bottle from hand to hand, laughing at the tickly bubbles, sharing and laughing together. The journey to Salva's new home required not one, but three planes. The first plane flew from Nairobi to Frankfurt, in a country called Germany. It landed with an alarming thump, then braked so hard that Salva was thrown forward in his seat. The strap across his stomach caught him hard. He took a second plane from Frankfurt to New York City. It too landed abruptly, but this time Salva was ready, and he held tightly to the armrests. In New York City, the aid worker led the boys to different gates. Some would be making the final leg of their trip alone, while others were in groups of 2 or 3. Salva was the only one going to Rochester. The aid worker said that his new family would be waiting for him there. On the plane to Rochester, most of the passengers were men traveling on their own. But there were also some women too, and a few families, mothers and fathers and children. Most of the people were white, beginning at the airport in Frankfurt. Selva had never seen more white people in the last few hours than he had before in his whole lifetime. He tried not to stare, but he couldn't help studying the families closely. Thoughts kept looping through his mind. What if my new family isn't there? What if they have changed their minds? What if they meet me and don't like me? Selva took a deep breath. A step at a time, he reminded himself. Just this flight to get through, for now. The plane landed at last, its wheels screeching, while Selva gripped the armrest and braced himself for what was to come. Okay, get my head out of the way. There they were, smiling and waving in the airport lobby, his new family. Chris the father, Louise the mother, here's Selva, right down here in the corner. 4 children. Selva would have siblings, just as he had before. He felt his shoulders relax a little on seeing their eager grins. Selva said hello and thank you many times, for in his fatigue and confusion, these were the only words he felt sure about. He could not understand what anyone was saying, especially Louise, who spoke so quickly that at first he was not even sure that she was speaking English. That's the mom. And yes, they did have more clothes for him. A big puffy jacket, a hat, a scarf, gloves. He put on the jacket and zipped it up. The sleeves were so bulky that he felt as if he couldn't move his arms properly. He wondered if he looked very foolish now, with his body and arms so fat and his legs so thin. But none of the family laughed at him, and he soon noticed that they were all wearing the same kind of jacket. The glass doors of the airport terminal slid open. The frigid air hit Selva's face like a slap. Never had he felt so cold before. In the part of Africa where he had lived all his life, the temperature rarely dropped below 70 degrees. When he inhaled, he thought his lungs would surely freeze solid and stop working. But all the people around him were still walking and talking and moving about. Apparently it was possible to survive in such cold temperatures. And he now understood the need for the awkward, padded jacket. Selva stood still inside the terminal doors for a few moments. Leaving the airport felt like leaving his old life forever. Sudan, his village, his family. Tears came to his eyes, perhaps from the cold air blowing in through the open doors. His new family was already outside. They turned and looked back at him. Selva blinked away the tears and took his first step into a new life in America. And now we're back to Naya's story. The well has been dug, the pump has been, they're in the process of finishing up this well. And this is what it's kind of going to end up looking like. It's a little bit of a cheat. This is Selva's new family. When he arrived in Rochester, New York, this was the family that was going, whose home he was going to be staying with. And this is pretty much where our story stopped. This is where we stopped. We've got 3 chapters left, which are very short. So lots of things are going to happen quickly. So I'm going to go ahead and start reading. I'm starting with Naya's story. All right. After the excitement of seeing the first spray of water, the villagers went back to work. Several men gathered in front of Naya's house. They had tools with them, hoes and spades and scythes. Her father went out to meet them. The men walked together to a spot beyond the second big tree and began clearing the land. Naya watched them for a moment. Her father saw her and waved. She put down the plastic can and ran over to him. "Papa, what are you doing?" "Clearing the land here, getting ready to build." "To build what?" Naya's father smiled. "Can't you guess? So make a prediction. What do you think the village could possibly be building now that they're going to have water within their village?" Think you'll be surprised. Some of you might guess it. All right, Rochester, New York. So this is going to be from the years 1996 to 2003. So we're looking at a 7-year span here of what's happening with Selva. So Selva had been in Rochester for nearly a month and still had not seen a single dirt road. Unlike southern Sudan, it seemed that here in America, every road was paved. At times, the cars whizzed by so fast he was amazed that anyone on foot could cross safely. His new father, Chris, told him that dirt roads did exist out in the countryside, but there were none in Selva's new neighborhood. All the buildings had electricity. There were white people everywhere. Snow fell from the sky for hours at a time and then stayed on the ground for days. Sometimes it would start to melt during the day, but before it all disappeared, more snow would fall. Salva's new mother, Louise, told him it would probably be April, 3 more months before the snow went away completely. The first several weeks of Salva's new life were so bewildering that he was grateful for his studies. His lessons, especially English, gave him something to concentrate on, a way to block out the confusion for an hour or two at a time. His new family helped too. All of them were kind to him, patiently explaining the millions of things he had to learn. It had taken 4 days for Salva to travel from the Ifo refugee camp to his new home in New York. There were times when he could hardly believe that he was still on the same planet. Now that Salva was learning more than a few simple words, he found the English language quite confusing. Letters like the letters O-U-G-H, rough, though, fought, through, and bow. The same letters were pronounced so many different ways, or how a word had to be changed depending upon the sentence. You said chickens when you meant the living birds that walked and squawked and laid eggs, but it was chicken with no S when it was on your plate ready to be eaten. We're having chicken for dinner. That was correct, even if you had cooked 100 chickens. Sometimes he wondered if he would ever be able to speak and read English well, but slowly, with hours of hard work over the months and years, his English improved. Remembering Michael, Salva had also joined a volleyball team. It was fun playing volleyball, just as it had been at the camp. Setting and spiking the ball were the same in any language. Salva had been in Rochester for more than 6 years now. He was going to college and had decided to study business. He had a vague idea that he would like to return to Sudan someday to help the people who lived there. Sometimes that seemed like an impossible notion. In his homeland, there was so much war and destruction, poverty, disease, and starvation, so many problems that had not been solved by governments or rich people or big aid organizations. What could he possibly do to help? Salva thought about this question a lot, but no answer came to him. One evening, at the end of a long day of study, Salva sat down at the family computer and opened his email. He was surprised to see a message from a cousin of his, someone he barely knew. The cousin was working for a relief agency in Zimbabwe, which is a country in Africa. Salva clicked open the message. His eyes read the words, but at first his brain could not comprehend them. United Nations Clinic, your father, stomach surgery. Salva read the words again and again. Then he jumped to his feet and ran through the house to find Chris and Louise. My father, he shouted. They have found my father. After several exchanges of emails, Salva learned that the cousin had not actually seen or spoken to his father. The clinic where his father was recovering was in a remote part of southern Sudan. There was no telephone or mail service, no way of communicating with the clinic staff. The staff kept lists of all the patients they treated. These lists were submitted to the United Nations aid agencies. Salva's cousin worked for one of the agencies, and he had seen the name of Salva's father on the list. Salva immediately began planning to travel to Sudan. But with the war still raging, it was very difficult to make the arrangements. He had to get permits, fill out dozens of forms, and organize plane flights and car transport in a region where there were no airports or roads. Salva and Chris and Louise, as well, spent hours on the phone to various agencies and offices. It took not days or weeks, but months before all the plans were in place, and there was no way to get a message to the hospital. At times, Salva felt almost frantic at the delays and frustrations. What if my father leaves the hospital without telling anyone where he's going? What if I get there too late and I will never be able to find him again? At last, all the forms were filled out and all the paperwork was in order. Salva flew in a jet to New York City, another one to Amsterdam, and a third to Kampala in Uganda. In Kampala, it took him 2 days to get through customs and immigration before he could board a smaller plane to go to Juba in southern Sudan. Then he rode in a jeep on dusty dirt roads into the bush. How familiar everything was, and yet how different. The unpaved roads, the scrubby bushes and trees, the huts roofed with thatched sticks bound together. Everything was just as Salva remembered it, as if he had left only yesterday. At the same time, the memories of his life in Sudan were very distant. How could memories feel so close and so far away at the same time? After many hours of jolting and bumping along the roads in the Jeep, after nearly a week of exhausting travel, Salva entered the shanty that served as a recovery room in the makeshift hospital. A white woman stood to greet him. "Hello," he said. "I'm looking for a patient named Mawan Dut Arik." All right, now we are at chapter 17, and it's going to be Naya's story. "What do you think we're building here?" Naya's father asked again, smiling. "A house?" Naya guessed. "Or a barn?" Her father shook his head. "Something better," he said. "A school." Did you guess that? Naya's eyes widened. The nearest school was half a day's walk from their home. Naya knew this because Deb had always wanted to go there, but it was too far. "A school?" she echoed. "Yes," he replied. "With the well here, no one will have to go to the pond anymore, so all the children will be able to go to school." Naya stared at her father. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. When at last she was able to speak, it was only in a whisper. "All of the children, Papa? The girls too?" Her father's smile grew broader. "Yes, Naya, girls too." He said, "Now go and fetch water for us." And he returned to his work, scything the long grass. So this is kind of a big event. This is kind of a breakthrough for the village. Because the girls are not going to have to keep making that journey to the well twice a day, or not to the well, sorry, to the pond twice a day to collect water, they're finally going to have a school in their community and be able to attend. So this is an example of what a school would look like. You see that the girls are wearing uniforms. In a lot of countries, kids do wear uniforms. So this is kind of what this classroom could look like. I don't know that this is the exact classroom. I don't think at all, but anyhow, it's kind of what it would be. All right, let's go back. Naya went back and picked up the plastic can. She felt as if she were flying. School. She would learn to read and write. So this is a big, huge event. All right, we are now at Salva's story. Salva stood at the foot of, let's see if I need to change the picture. Okay, I'm gonna peek ahead for you. Oop, backward. All right. Salva stood at the foot of the beds in the crowded clinic. "Hello," he said. "Hello," the patient replied politely. "I've come to visit you," Salva said. "To visit me?" the man frowned. "But who are you?" "You are Mawan Dut Arik, aren't you?" "Yes, that is my name." Salva smiled, his insides trembling. Even though his father looked older now, Salva recognized him right away. And in this picture, this is Salva right here, and this is his father right here. And we're going to actually meet him in a minute when we get to the end, and this is going to be part of a video, so you're going to get to hear him talk, his father talk. Okay. Salva had recognized him right away, but it was as if his eyes needed help from his ears. He needed to hear his father's words to believe it was real. "I'm your son. I am Salva." The man looked at Salva and shook his head. "No," he said, "it is not possible." "Yes, Salva." "Yes," Salva said, "it's me, father." And he moved to the side of the bed. "Ha!" Mawan Dut reached out and touched the arm of the tall stranger beside him. "Salva?" he whispered. "Can it really be you?" Salva waited. Mawan Dut stared for a long moment. Then he cried out, "Salva, my son, my son." His body shaking with sobs of joy, he reached up to hug Salva tightly. So now remember, it has been, 11 years he was traveling, and then he's 6, so it's 17 years. So his father had not seen him for 17 years. And when he saw him, he was an 11-year-old boy. So it would make sense that to the father, he would have a hard time recognizing him. So, what a moment, huh? All right. Oh, I'm wrong. It had been almost 19 years since they had last seen each other. Mawan Dut sprinkled water on his son's head, the Dinka way of blessing someone who was lost and is found again. "Everyone was sure you were dead," Mawan Dut said. "The village wanted to kill a cow for you." That's how Salva's people mourned the death of a loved one. "I would not let them," his father said. "I never gave up hope that you were still alive somewhere." And my mother?" Salva asked, barely daring to hope. His father smiled. She is back in the village. Salva wanted to laugh and cry at the same time. I must see her. But his father shook his head. There is still war near Lorne Arik, my son. If you went there, both sides would try to force you to fight with them. You must not go. There was so much more to talk about. His father told Salva that his sisters were with his mother, but of his 3 brothers, only Ring had survived the war. Arik, the oldest, and Kual, the youngest, were both dead. Little Kual, Salva closed his eyes for a few moments, trying to picture his brothers through a haze of time and grief. He learned about his father's illness. Years of drinking contaminated water had left Mauen Dute's entire digestive system riddled with guinea worms. Sick and weak, he had walked almost 300 miles to come to this clinic, and he was barely alive by the time he finally arrived. Salva and his father had several days together, but all too soon it was time for Salva to return to America. His father would be leaving the clinic shortly after as well. The surgery he had undergone had been successful, and he would soon be strong enough to walk the long walk home. Okay, guys, I don't know if I could walk 30 miles, let alone 300 miles. So if it's 120 miles from here to Chicago, that would be walking up, back, and halfway up again. Okay, couldn't do it. Sometimes I can hardly drive up there. I will come to the village, Salva promised, as soon as it is safe. We will be there waiting for you, his father promised in return. Salva pressed his face tightly to his father's as they hugged goodbye, their tears flowing and blending together. On the plane back to the United States, Salva replayed in his mind every moment of his visit with his father. He felt again the coolness on his brow when his father had sprinkled the water blessing on him. And an idea came to him, an idea of what he might be able to do to help the people of Sudan. Could he do it? It would take so much work. Perhaps it would be too difficult. But how would he know unless he tried? Back in Rochester, Salva began working on his idea. There were, it seemed, 1,000,000 problems to be solved. He needed a lot of help. Chris and Louise gave him many suggestions. Scott, a friend of theirs, was an expert in setting up projects like the one Salva had in mind. He and Salva worked together for hours and days, which grew into weeks and months. Along the way, Salva met other people who wanted to help. He was grateful to all of them, but even with their help, it was much more work than he had imagined. Salva had to raise money for the project, and there was only one way to do this. He would have to talk to people and ask them to give money. The first time Salva spoke in front of an audience was in a school cafeteria. About 100 people came to hear him. There was a microphone in front of the room. Salva's knees were shaking as he walked to the mic. He knew that his English was still not very good. What if he made mistakes in pronunciation? What if the audience couldn't understand him? But he had to do it. If he didn't talk about the project, no one would learn about it. No one would donate money, and he would never be able to make it work. Salva spoke into the microphone. Hello, he said. At that moment, something went wrong with the sound system. The speakers behind him let out a dreadful screech, and Salva jumped and almost dropped the mic. His hands trembling, he looked out at the audience. People were smiling or chuckling. A few of the children were holding their ears. They all looked very friendly, and seeing the children made him remember. It was not the first time he had spoken in front of a large group of people. Years before, when he was leading those boys on their walk from the Ethiopian refugee camp to the one in Kenya, he had called a meeting every morning and evening. The boys would line up facing him, and he would talk to them about their plans. All those eyes looking at him, but every face interested in what he had to say. It was the same here. The audience had come to the school cafeteria because they wanted to hear him. Thinking of that made him feel a little better, and he spoke into the mic again. Hello, he repeated, and this time only his own voice came from the speakers. He smiled in relief and went on. I'm here to talk to you about a project for Southern Sudan. A year passed, then 2, then 3. Salva spoke to hundreds of people in churches, at civic organizations, in schools. Would he ever be able to turn his idea into reality? Whenever he found himself losing hope, Salvo would take a deep breath and think of his uncle's words, a step at a time, one problem at a time, just figure out this one problem. Day by day, solving one problem at a time, Salvo moved toward his goal. All right, chapter 18. And chapter 18 only has one story, and it's going to be Naya's story. Why do you think that is? Why do you think we're going to be done with Selva? Are we done with Selva right here at the end of chapter 17? All right, let's see what happens. All right, we're at Southern Sudan. It is the year 2009. Naya waited her turn in line. She was holding a plastic bottle. The well was finally finished. The gravel had been put down to make a foundation. The pump had been installed and the cement had been poured and left to dry. And this really is the picture that we saw. I'm going to back up a little bit. This is now the picture of what this well looks like in her village. And they've got the foundation made, and now people can come and you can see that the water coming out of here is clean, and it's something that people are able to drink. I'm going to leave it on this page for a second because if you look at this really closely, you might start to recognize somebody. All right, here we go. Before the pump was used for the first time, the villagers had all gathered around. The leader of the workers brought out a big sign made of blue canvas. The canvas had writing on it. The writing was in English, but the leader spoke to Naya's uncle, and Uncle told everyone what the sign said. In honor of Elm Street School, Uncle said, this is the name of a school in America. The students at the school raised the money for this well to be dug. Uncle held up one end of the sign. The workers' leader held up the other end. Everyone else stood around, and one of the workers took their picture. The picture would be sent to the American school so the students could see the well and the people who are now using it. Then the villagers all got in line to wait their turn for water from the new well. When Naya reached the head of the line, she smiled shyly at her uncle, who paused at his work for a moment to smile back at her. Then he began moving the pump handle up and down, up and down. A stream of water flowed from the mouth of the pump. Naya held her bottle underneath the pump mouth. The bottle filled up quickly. She stepped aside to let the next person fill a bottle. Then she drank it. The water was delicious. It wasn't warm or muddy like the water from the pond. It was cool and clear. Naya stopped drinking and held up the bottle so she could look at it. Funny that something without any color at all could look so nice. She drank a few more sips, then glanced around. Everyone had a bottle or a cup. They were drinking that lovely water, or waiting in line for more, or talking and laughing. It was a celebration. An old granddad standing not far from Naya shook his head. In a loud voice he said, "This is where we used to gather for our bonfire celebrations. I've been sitting on this ground my whole life, and all those years I never knew that I was sitting on top of this good water." Everyone around him laughed. Naya laughed too. In a few more days the school would be finished. Naya and Deb and Akir would all go to school along with the other children. Next year there would be a marketplace where the villagers could sell and buy vegetables and chickens and other goods. There was even talk of a clinic someday, a medical clinic, so they wouldn't have to walk so far to get help, as they had when Akir was ill. It was the well that was bringing the village all of these good things. But the well was not for their use alone. People would come from miles around to fetch the good, clean water. Naya knew from listening to the grown-ups that the crew leader had made many arrangements concerning the well. No one was ever to be refused water. Some of the villagers would be responsible for maintaining the well. They would be busy with the new work, so the entire village was to help them with their crops and cattle. Other villagers, including Naya's uncle, would resolve any disputes that arose. The well would change their lives in many ways. I've never again had to walk to the pond for water, Naya thought. She wandered around a little, sipping at her cool, fresh drink. Then she caught sight of the crew leader. He was standing by himself, leaning against one of the trucks and watching her uncle work the pump. Deb saw her looking at the man. That man, the boss of the workers? Deb said. You know he is a Dinka. Naya looked at Deb in astonishment. The Dinka and the Noor did not look very different physically. You had to look at the scar pattern on people's faces to tell the tribes apart. Dinka scar patterns were different from those of the Noor. But the crew leader had no scars on his face. Naya had heard some of the teenage boys talking about that, wondering why he had no scars when he clearly was a grown man. The leader's assistant was Noor. So were most of the crews. They all had Noor scars. Naya hadn't thought about it much, but she realized now she had always assumed that the leader was Noor too. The Dinka and the Noor were enemies, had been for hundreds of years. Why would a Dinka bring water to us? She wondered aloud. Well, I heard Uncle and Father talking about him, Depp said. He has drilled many wells for his own people. This year he decided to drill for the Noor as well. Depp had not really answered Naya's question. He probably doesn't know the answer, she thought. But now Naya felt there was something she had to do. She walked over to where the man was standing. He didn't notice her at first, so she waited quietly. Then he saw her. Hello, he said. Shyness flooded through Naya. For a moment, she didn't think she'd be able to speak. She looked down at him. She looked down at the ground, then at the stream of water flowing from the pump mouth. And she found her voice. Thank you, she said, and looked up at him bravely. Thank you for bringing the water. The man smiled. What is your name? He asked. I am Naya. I'm happy to meet you, Naya, he said. My name is Salva. The end. I hope you liked this story. And I'm going to show you now. Oh, I'm going the wrong direction. I'm going to show you a little bit of a video and let you actually listen to Salva talk and explain what he did. So I'm going to go to this. All right, here we go.
This is the house I was born in. That's where I grew up. That's where I was born. And I used to play here with my cousin. That's my uncle's house. My grandfather was buried here.
Sudan is Africa's largest country. For 21 years, a civil war raged between northern and southern Sudan. Nearly 2 million people died. 4 million were displaced. During fierce government attacks in 1985, amid gunfire and bomb blasts, 17,000 southern Sudanese boys fled into the bush. They became known as the Lost Boys of Sudan. The Lost Boys trekked 1,800 miles across the desert, fending off lions and hyenas, eventually living in refugee camps, first in Ethiopia, then Kenya. During their journey, about 5,000 of the boys perished from hunger, thirst, disease, exploding bombs, or attacks by animals and soldiers. The 12,000 who survived ended up in the UN-sponsored refugee camp in Kakuma, Kenya. In 1996, Salva Duke was one of the first of 3,800 lost boys selected for resettlement in the United States.
When I came here, I was sponsored by Episcopal Church. This is how I get here. And when I came here, I didn't know anything. And when I get out from my apartment, walking about 5 blocks, I could not remember to go back to my place again because everything looked the same.
Salva is now an American citizen. He lives in Rochester, New York, and is working on his bachelor's degree in international business.
And I have to make sure that I work hard enough to support myself and educate myself as much as I can. And I'm sure maybe a lot of you read about what is going on in Sudan and what happened. During the wartime, my dad took me to school. And when he took me there, the war broke out and then I depart and we never see each other again. And I didn't know where my dad was for about 19 years. And when I heard about him, he was sick because of waterborne diseases, and he was in the clinic of UN. He walked close to 300 miles to go to that clinic, and he walked there many, many days to get there. I said I should go and see my dad before he passed away. And when I went there to that clinic, I saw my dad. He was very weak. And I walked to my dad. I said, "Hey, Dad, how are you?" And he said, "Who are you?" I said, "I'm Salva Dude." And he was starting with emotion. And he sprayed the water on my body and said that it's a sign of the while coming back, he felt like I was dead and I'm coming out from the tomb. The doctor told him that he need to start drinking clean water. If not, he might get sick again and get some waterborne diseases again. He might die. When I went back to US, I said I should do something to help my dad and other people who are in the same situation as well. And that's where I formed a non-profit organization called Water for Sudan. That's why I'm here today. And now he's drinking clean water, he's healthy. I was starting it because of him, but I find there was so much need for others. And if you help them, these people someday they may help others. And that's what really gives me energy, because it's helping the life of the people.